right, we're doing People and Empires in the Americas. This is chapter 13, and today we'll go through numbers 1 through 8. So our first page. So this started about 70,000 to 10,000 years ago. There is a disagreement among scholars as to exactly what date that these people came. So the first people to come to the Americas came from Asia across the Bering Strait during the Ice Ages. So this land bridge was created when the water level dropped. Obviously the blue and the tan would have just been water today, but during the Ice Age the level dropped and it created a land bridge. All of the tan and white was land, so people were able to walk across. Didn't come in large groups, nor did they come all at one time. Theoretically, over several thousand years, they migrated across. Probably early on, going farther south into South America, then as the climate improved, possibly stopping off earlier and earlier until maybe some of the later groups or last groups would have been the Eskimo or the Inuit people, as they prefer to be called. So the geography of the area, we've got our western mountains, the Rockies, two great rivers, Amazon and the Mississippi. There's the Atacama Desert in South America. And, okay, sorry. Okay, the first group we're going to talk about, so typically in this region, most people know the Aztec, Inca, and the Maya, but there are quite a few other groups that lived in this area at this time. So one of the first groups, the Olmecs, they were established on the coast of the Gulf of Mexico. So here's the Gulf of Mexico, country of Mexico today. So right along that area is where they settled. The time that they're there is about the time that Egypt ruled the Kushites. They had a hieroglyphic form of writing, probably one of the oldest forms of writing in the Western Hemisphere, and this one was never deciphered. They had a mathematical system, and calendar were adopted by other people in the area later on. They also had a numbering system where a single bar would represent 5, a dot was 1, and they even had some kind of almost a seashell looking thing that represented 20. The word Olmec means rubber people because they were one of the first, or the first group to tap trees for their sap that eventually would be used to make rubber. The most dramatic remains from this group are the giant stone heads that were carved, some 40 to 60 tons. And again, the mystery really, how were these people able to move them? This group had a ceremonial ball game as a religious ritual, and later on it was the Mayans that also had this religious ritual. They kind of a combination basketball, soccer. So you got the stone ring and the ball. You had to hit it off your hip or elbow, feet, kind of like soccer where you can't use your hands today. And then some of the losing groups were actually sacrificed. They also constructed huge temples and monuments for worship, and unlike the Egyptian pyramids, these were strictly for worship. And they must have had a highly organized society that was led by priests, again, in order to create some of these temples and to do the types of things that they did in those areas would have taken great leadership. Interesting, though, that even though they've built some of these temples, these were not found until about the 20th century. So I asked my students what happened in the early part of the 1900s, the early 20th century, that would allow these to be discovered. And the invention was the airplane. When people were able to fly over this area, they looked down and saw these hills, these little small mountains, and they thought, well, those look really strange. I'm sure they're flat on all four sides. So they went down and investigated and found a lot of these temples that were buried under vegetation. Because the Olmecs influenced other people in things like their carvings, sculpture, writing, number systems, the calendar, style of architecture, and the ritual ball game, they are considered the parent culture of the region. In our new textbook, it mentions the mother culture. Their culture disappeared and remains a mystery. We don't really know what happened to them, whether they were driven off, disease, and this happened to a few groups. Okay, so I'm going to change my page here. I rewrote these differently from their original. So the next group we'll talk about are the Incas. Conquered the valley of the Andes by 1438 around their capital city of Cusco. And eventually their empire stretched for over 2,000 miles. They began as a small tribe and became powerful through conquest. So through taking over other groups, they were able to become very strong. The Andes Mountains are on the western coast of South America. They run for about, again, 2,000 miles was the empire. These mountains, they have 10 peaks that are over 20,000 feet high, so very rugged terrain. The crops that they grew included 700 varieties of potatoes, which is quite interesting. They also had the llama and alpaca that they had domesticated. Of course, the students usually will bring up the movie Emperor's New Groove and their capital city of Cuscotopia. So Cusco, very similar there. All right, a system of roads connected the empire. So even though the empire was 2,000 miles long, they had eventually about 12,000 miles of roads that they had built throughout the empire, through the mountains all over, connecting their different parts. They had swinging woven bridges that crossed these rivers and canyons, and tunnels that were dug through the mountains. And then probably one of the most famous cities that was built in the mountains is the city of Machu Picchu. Sits about 7,000 feet above sea level. Very beautiful with the steep cliffs on the side, the little peak there in the back. Just amazing when you look at the steep side and how much terracing they had to put in there to build that up. Okay, I think just a couple more. This one is quipus. These were knotted strings, knotted colored strings that were used to keep numerical records because this group lacked a written language. Things like population, food supply, maybe even important dates and events could have been kept track of. By the 15th century, the Incas and the Aztecs were the two major warrior states. We'll talk about the Aztecs on page 2. And then these groups were also threatened by the Spanish. So that just like the Aztecs, some of these other groups were also threatened. Okay. So this group also adopted achievements of earlier cultures. A couple of interesting things, this one especially. So they ground the rocks down and fitted them together that even today, if you take a knife, you cannot put the knife blade between those stones. That's really amazing. This circular area, they were able to duplicate any climate of their region. So anything down in lower sea level or lower elevation up to higher elevations, and the different crops that they could grow, they duplicated that in these stepped terrace round areas. And so that should finish page 1. So thank you.